and apparently is going to speak about the resurrection. So anyway, here we go. It's easier for us to see in hindsight, of course, but that Jesus walked out of the tomb shrugging off death like a mild cold should have been obvious to us, even predictable. I know we were surprised, but we really had no right to be. The first few verses of the Bible lay out a pattern, and it's a pattern that was to follow down through the ages. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Formless, empty, and dark, the pre-created form, the pre-ordered form. Genesis 1 verse 2, thus providing the contrasting chaos from which order would arrive. And the order that would soon arrive would stand in stark contrast to formless, empty, and dark. It would be creation, fullness, and light. We see this, of course, in its most splendid form when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Son grounding this new creation in the pattern within the foundation already laid down by his Father. Our young prince walking into a world that was dark, lost, and empty, and offering us light and fullness of life, surrounded by chaos, yet bringing order wherever he stepped into every situation that presented itself to him, and into every life that was courageous enough to approach him. And what order, even now today, it's the argument that atheists fear the most, this inexplicable presence of order, pattern, and design. Even in a fallen world, we can still see the fingerprints, the DNA, the evidence of someone who cares. If there is no God, then we must assume that luck and chance have been remarkably benevolent toward us. If there is a God, then we're forced to conclude that this is all the work of someone who, at the very least, cares for us. Even in its cursed and redemptively disciplining state, it's still difficult to assume anything less than whoever made this cares for those for whom it was made. And quite frankly, we shouldn't even need scripture to relay the point that whoever made this cares for us. A bird will prove it. A bee will prove it. An ocean can prove it. A tree, for Pete's sake. A tree can make the point. I don't know if you've ever looked at a tree. I don't know why you would never look at a tree. And I mean, really looked at it. And the more we're learning about them, the more our minds are being blown. We used to think they're just trees. But now we know that they're all connected and they're all communicating. And each one of them is its own little universe, its own little ecosystem. Jesus wasn't underestimating or downplaying when he compared the kingdom of heaven to a tree. Joyce Kilmer, obviously captivated by the species, said this: I think that I shall never see, and she's a poet, understand, this is a poet speaking. She says, I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the sweet earth's flowing breast, a tree that looks at God all day and lifts her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. And then she finishes with these two lines. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. Joyce and people like Joyce, how they so effortlessly, so simply say things and expose so effortlessly the bumbling words of those of us who are desperately trying to say something. According to Joyce, trees prove everything that needs to be proved. So we shouldn't really need scripture to relay the point that he cares for us. A tree can do it, and we have far more than a tree. The complexity of that which is around us increasingly astounds us, and it doesn't even matter in which direction we look. When we look out, the vastness of space, uncountable galaxies, never mind uncountable stars. We're running out of fingers for our galaxies now. And that's if all we see in the observable universe is all there is to see. Now we're beginning to think there's more that lies beyond. But even without it, even if all we could observe was the globe on which we ride, we still haven't even negotiated our ways to the ends and the depths of this yet. More species than we can catalogue, more heights and depths than we can fathom. We're lucky to get to some of them, never mind research them once we arrive. And although many of us for many years now have exhausted their lives in examination of what is around us, in the hope of shining just one more dimly lit candle onto the subject, the perceivable order is just beginning to dawn on us. No doubt in part because those who deny a God or gods, they know and understand what perceivable order would imply. We need scripture because that's where we find the credit being laid at the appropriate feet. They opened the Millennium Bridge in London, and you can look at this footage online if you want. They opened the Millennium Bridge in London in the year 2000 and shut it down. I think they shut it down the very same day, within hours. If you watch the footage, you'll see them opening the bridge and then hundreds of people walking over the bridge. Everyone's all happy. And before too long, they closed it down because the bridge itself was being placed under uncalculated stress, because for some inexplicable reason, everyone began walking in sync. It's like the March of the Penguins. And that made the bridge begin to sway. And the more the bridge swayed, the more people got in step. And it is a cycle. The same thing happened in Manchester, in fact. I think it was the First World War, the bridge was built. They built this bridge in Manchester, fantastic bridge. And then troops, military on the way to the First World War, marched across the bridge and nearly brought the thing down. In fact, there's still a sign on the bridge today: military must break step before crossing this bridge. But for a brief moment on the Millennium Bridge, we witnessed what appears to be built into the entire system. Hundreds of people all walking out of sync, nothing connecting them at all except the bridge. Chaos. To suddenly all walking in step with each other. And the reason for this is becoming increasingly transparent, that when there's an underlying or overhanging connection, on this occasion a bridge, given long enough and given the right conditions, order will break out. And it naturally occurs. Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock so that sailors could better define precisely where they were on the ocean. They needed the latitude. They had the longitude because of the stars, or they had the latitude and needed the longitude. I can't remember which one he had, but what they needed for the other one was a timekeeping device. And unfortunately, back in the 1600s, clocks were notoriously unreliable. So Christian Huygens, in effort to build a more reliable clock, invented the pendulum clock. And evidently one day, while he was sick, he was running some experiments in his house, and he hung one of his clocks from the central beam in his home, and then hung another clock, another pendulum clock beside it, with the pendulums swinging freely back and forth, out of step with each other. But he noticed within a very short period of time, these pendulums started swinging together and then stayed together. They didn't overlap and then go away again. They stayed together. And even if he bumped one of the pendulums, eventually, it happened every time. The other clocks on the workbench or on the other side of the room, they were still swinging out of sync. But the clocks that were hung from the same beam were all brought into order. And we found that the same thing happens with metronomes. And this is an experiment you can run with your children. Well, you know, if you've got a few metronomes kicking around, who doesn't? But if you take a few metronomes and balance them all on the same board, even hundreds of them, and they're all beating out of time, eventually all these metronomes will start keeping the same beat and they don't shift. Evidently, if the machines are all connected to something beyond themselves, their individual vibrations all bump each other and nudge each other into perfect alignment. It's a great illustration for the unity of the church. If we'll all be intelligent enough to stay connected to the correct beam. But that's not where I'm going tonight. What is not as easily decipherable as the pendulum clocks and the metronomes is why we're beginning to see the same thing in nature. And we're beginning to see the same thing in nature. This is now being detected in, amongst other things, the trees, but other things. This is happening not only with inorganic material like clocks and pendulums and metronomes, but it's also beginning to be spotted among the organic. Lightning bugs, I don't know if you've ever witnessed a field of lightning bugs all flashing, but I watched a documentary the other month, and they filmed the bug through time lapse. And they begin all flashing all over the place. And then it looks like rays of light passing. And then they all start blinking together. They all bring each other into sync. Even the plants and the trees are set around us to maintain order and balance. They just so happen to consume the carbon dioxide that we don't necessarily need. Which is something that doesn't, I see that this is something that doesn't seem to dawn on a lot of people today, that if there's no carbon dioxide, the plants will die. That's what they eat, for Pete's sake. And now we know that when there's an abundance of carbon dioxide, the trees gorge themselves and they go into overdrive and they get bigger and fuller and healthier and more productive, producing more and more of the same, all to produce this balance. And the lungs of the planet, I don't know if you know this, the lungs of the planet are not the rainforests. Seagrass, we now know, in relation to the oxygen production, seagrass makes the rainforests look like a daycare facility with the amount of oxygen that it produces. Which, if I was God, that's the way I would have done it. I wouldn't have made the Amazon rainforest the lungs of the planet, because I would have known we want to chop that stuff down. But who wants seagrass? No one. So we're safe. Unfortunately, we live in a world, and if you've turned on the news, you'll have noticed this already. It appears that in our world, a message that says, hey, relax everybody. This planet that God created is astoundingly robust and resilient and self-governing. Unfortunately, that message doesn't sell as much advertising as we're all going to die next year. I think, and this may be a speculation, but I think the science community has finally discovered what the religious community has known for centuries, that if you want the cash, you terrify people. Anyway, they can find another sucker for their scaremongering. This is my Father's world, and it will accomplish that for which he intended it to. And it's going nowhere and doing nothing until he says so. And I get a little anxious sometimes when I see especially believers worrying about this stuff. They seem to give the impression that God's running around heaven, wringing his hands, thinking, oh man, I should have planted more trees. I had no idea they'd find all that coal and oil. This planet will function the same way that it has, by the determination of the one who made it, and the sheer order within the system ought to bring us confidence in this. We shouldn't be like these chicken little people throwing themselves off of their ideological skyscrapers because they believe the planet's stock market has crashed. We're meant to be the ones telling them, look, there's no need for this concern. This is our Father's world, and it's in good hands. And just like Jesus, we ought to be doing all we can to bring order to the chaos that we find around us. A neighbor who's financially hurting, a friend whose health is diminishing, a church that's crumbling, a brother and sister who are mourning. 5 days ago, I went to get some wood. I finally found a guy that gives away free wood. And I go down and fill up my truck and cut it and burn it. And I keep some, if it's nice wood, to make some of the crosses that I make. And while me and the guy next door, Howie, were chopping up the wood, another neighbor came over and told us that his heating had gave out and that they wouldn't be able to fix it until February. Now, I know a lot of you don't think it gets cold in Arizona. It gets cold in Arizona. And his little house is thrown into chaos. So Howie and I went down and got more wood He didn't have the ability to get the wood, didn't have the ability to chop the wood. So we got the wood, we chopped the wood and brought order into that little neighbor's home. Now, I know that's small and comparatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but I'm only one pendulum. You're only one metronome. But introducing order to chaos, an effort to show the world that darkness does not extinguish light and that the opposite is true. This is our Father's work. I wish we still burned candles. I think the electricity is maybe the worst thing that happened to the church. Because if we still burned candles, we'd still know just how much darkness one candle can handle. But given enough time, and when we have the attention of those around us, we can talk to people about the resilience and the order that's occurring around them. We can draw their attention to these things. Their God has made it for them to observe it, and that it's occurred throughout history, and that we can show them that nothing out of the ordinary is happening, and that it's the same God, and he's working the same way as he always has, the same as he did yesterday, the same as he did today, and the same as he will tomorrow. He's bringing order from chaos. And as we noted from the opening verses of the book in Genesis, order from chaos. And when the dove returns to the ark with an olive leaf in its mouth, what is that? That's order following the chaos of the flood. And when they arrive at Sinai and receive the law, and God's light begins to pour into the world in such a dynamic form, what is that? That's order following the chaos of Egypt. And when Israel enters the promised land and clears the promised land, what is that? That's order following the chaos of communities of idolaters who were sacrificing their children for a better harvest. If we're to help people, if we're to really help people, we need to teach them to stop fearing the chaos. And if they must fear, then fear the orderer. But from the beginning, order from chaos. And then Jesus arrives. Jesus arrives and we see the exact same thing. Everywhere he goes, he meets a man demon-possessed. You want to know how possessed this guy was? Legion. What's your name? Legion. We don't have time to give you our individual identities. Just be assured there's a ton of us in here. He's breaking the chains that bind him. Living in the tombs. Did you catch that when you read it? Living in the tombs. Living among the dead. He's in the grave. Dark, formless, void. A single life representative of the entire system could not be more chaotic. One word from Jesus Christ. One word. And what does the text say? Sitting, ordered, clothed, formed, and in his right mind. What is that? The meaningless, empty, void, dead and decaying voice of chaos that was howling among the tombs is now bursting with the fullness of life and potential and meaning and purpose and seeking to follow the one who just delivered him. That one little metronome brought right into sync with the divine Christian Huygens. If ever one biblical event captured the entire narrative, it's that little story. Then he meets a woman. 10 minutes later, you'd think he was exhausted. 10 minutes later, he meets a woman bleeding for 12 years. I don't know that I've ever suffered anything for more than 12 minutes. Let me think. But there she is, physically destroyed, spiritually broken, emotionally and financially bankrupt. Her life is chaos. Her life is wrecked. What does she do? She touches the hem. The hem that doesn't even get to touch him. The fringe of him, for Pete's sake. She doesn't get to touch him. She only gets to touch the thing that's touching him. And that alone resurrects order out of chaos. And instantly she knows. She goes cowering away, and Jesus grabs her and says, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You don't light a light and hide it. You get it up and you stand it up that everybody can see. Come here, sweetheart. Let them all see." All of these people who are jostling for position, all of these people that might be bragging, "I'm closest to Jesus, I'm closest to Jesus." Let them see what it means to touch me. And of course, he knew, he always knows. Of course, the Creator knows when creation is taking place. But what happened is order following chaos. This is all the new creation bursting from him, bringing order to the old cursed creation. And it's happening everywhere he goes. He's a splash of color in a black and white world. He's balance in a room full of falling and fallen people. He's the candle in a darkened room, unignorable. He is everything that should be exalted in this world, being lifted up for all to see, being painted against the backdrop of a God-denying world, a chaotic world, bringing order wherever he steps and destroying the chaos. The chaos of 5,000 hungry people solved with a packed lunch. The chaos of a storm threatening to kill them, annihilated by a single rebuke. And then also included in this, of course, is his teaching, bringing order to the prevailing and chaotic wisdom of the day, where when Jesus arrived, he says, "Look, I know what you're saying. All right, tell me again. All right, what? Right, okay. I'm telling you, no, you got it wrong. I know what you're saying. I know it makes sense to you, but I'm telling you, no, you got it wrong. Love your enemies." I know that sounds crazy to you, but I'm telling you, it's the truth. Bless those who curse you. I know this seems upside down and backwards to you, but it isn't. Forgive those who abuse you. Turn the cheek. Go the extra mile. Even just listening to Jesus gives us an idea as to just how out of sync we were before he arrived. Do you think we're bad now? This is us with 2,000 years of hearing him. Words like lost and blind don't convey the idea that all we needed was a little dusting down. Words like sick and dead were not the pat on the back we might have been expecting. When Jesus says the way up in the kingdom is down, when Jesus says if you want to be first, you got to be last. When Jesus says if you want to be the greatest, you got to be the least. When Jesus says the exalted things will be humbled and the humbled things will be exalted. When Jesus says if you want to save your life, you must lose it, and whoever loses his life will find it. when Jesus speaks like this, look, when the solution he's offering us is the exact opposite of what we believe, the message is simple. You couldn't be more wrong. When up is down and first is last and greatest is least and the exalted is humble and saving is losing and losing is saving. When we're believing the opposite of that which is true, we couldn't be more wrong. Christ was a theological, social, political tsunami that sent a wave around the entire globe. And it's still going. Although I think this must be made clear, especially if we're going to talk about sin. I don't need to tell you that God doesn't pull punches when he's talking about sin. It's one of the marvels of Jesus. No one was tougher on sin than Jesus, and yet he was surrounded by sinners. But he doesn't pull punches when he's talking about sin, the depth of it, the degree of it, the dangers of it. He makes no apologies for using the strongest language available when discussing it. But this we must know. None of that language is ever spoken by God in effort to turn his people into guilt-ridden, miserable wrecks. That's not love. That's manipulation most vile. Rather, I believe the depravity of our situation is clearly spelled out. Firstly, that we might appreciate the danger that we're in. Secondly, to articulate the lengths to which God will ride to rescue us. For if all we think he's forgiven us of are a couple of boo-boos, then he's not much of a savior. I could do that. And lastly, I believe he speaks this way in order to produce gratitude, that single characteristic that brings praise both to the child and the parent simultaneously. So, when this thrill of hope brought rejoicing to our weary world, and yonder broke on that new and glorious morn, who was it that was bringing us this message? Considering just how wrong we were, one might assume a tyrant would have been in order, a dictator who'd only be satisfied with the blood of his enemies. And yet, what did we get? A shepherd. A shepherd capable not only of dealing with the wolves and the bears and the lions, but one who's also capable of lifting up those little lambs and holding them and holding the beasts at bay and blowing ever so gently into those little wicks and binding those reeds and speaking these words into us, words of comfort and strength, words that would grip our bending spines and begin to stiffen them so that we no longer resemble the beasts that crawl on the earth, but man who stands on the earth. Words that carried us, words that carried us into the belly of the Colosseum, singing, singing to Caesar. Our first song. Caesar, we have a song for you. It's entitled, You're in His Seat. So what does all that have to do with resurrection? Is there anything we face that's more chaotic than death? Among all the things that we fear, isn't that it? And what does he do with it? Doesn't take much imagination to see Christ working the miracles, but always keeping his eye beyond the crowd as he sees death circling, always getting closer, snarling at him, biting at him like a rabid dog. He sees who it has in its grip. He passionately loves those. And death tightening the grip, making us afraid, just like any father witnessing someone terrifying his own child. For 3.5 years, his indignation and wrath rising until the day is set and the fight begins. And where do we find him the night before the fight? In the garden, sitting in the corner of the ring with his father, gaining the last few ounces of courage necessary to beat this beast. Since the garden, death has held us in its grip. Since the garden, in spite of many valiant efforts, every single one of us has fallen to it. Until a young Galilean stood up and said, "It's time." We know they cast lots for his clothing. That's Bible language for Jesus saying, "Hold my coat." And then it was on. Life and death, ding, ding. And out they come. Death ripping into him on the greatest stage on earth, Jerusalem, the city on a hill. There will only be one winner. And you got to admit it. He had us going for a while. For 3 days. 3 days we held our breath. Convinced, utterly convinced that the best we had failed. And we were now forever at the mercy of the beast. And for 3 days, celebrations in hell, all the best people were there. Music turned up, blast, partying, success, celebration. Death had triumphed. And then someone turned the sound down. Someone turned the music down. Satan said, "What are you doing?" And the guy said, "Hold on, shh." Did anybody hear that? Did anybody hear that? Shh, there it is again. And a stone begins to roll, a ton of rock grinding against the dirt. And we looked. Him! It was him. We thought there was something different about him before he died. And he walks out. He walks out with death in his hand, limp, like a crumpled rag. And he smiles toward us and he says, "What? That? That's what you were afraid of?" Casts it aside with all the contempt it deserves. And the promise of promises, that what we saw that day will one day come to us all. As Frank now knows, the entire system will be brought to order, restored. All the chaos, all of it, all that frightened you and frightens you still, gone. All that crippled you and cripples you still, gone. All that shamed you and shames you still, gone. Remember the pendulum clocks and the metronomes and the lightning bugs? Guess what? Our beloved scientists and physicists are now beginning to believe they're seeing the same thing happening in the stars and in the planets and in the galaxies, that they're all nudging. And this is amazing, the scientific community, because as they see it, there is no connection. They're not all hung from the same beam. To which we reply, oh, yes, they are. We're out of time. Look, I know your lives are out of sync here and there. And I know sometimes there's even times when it looks like it's all coming together and all your metronomes are beginning to align and everything's great. And then some moron bumps the table and you're all over the place again. Doesn't matter. The performance of your swing is not the crux of it all. All that matters is that you're hung from the right beam. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And on a hill just outside Jerusalem, Jesus confirmed what Joyce proclaimed: a tree proves everything. And thank God we're all hung from the same tree. Nevertheless, we live, and we will stand because our Father is able to make us stand. Thank you for your patience tonight. I try to calm myself down.